Hi, welcome to the Frugal Frau. I'm Sukey, your host, and today we're going to make a saw bench, and this is the very saw bench that we will be making in this video. And this is going to be my saw bench because this is Tom's and it's a little bit too tall for me. And what I need in a saw bench is something that's a little smaller, lighter, not so wide, and shorter so that when I saw, I can get a lot more leverage. So that's what we're going to make today. Now, we're going to have a part 2 of this video, and we're going to add a removable shaving horse to this. So before we get started though, please like, subscribe, and comment. These are the basic pieces that you have to cut for this bench. Well, this is just going to be a utilitarian saw bench. So we started off with a couple pieces of old stair tread, and you can see they're pretty rough and they have caulk and all kinds of junk on them, and they've been out under the lean-to in the barn, so they're pretty nasty and dirty. So Tom is going to plane them off and clean them up and flatten them out. Tom is just scribing the depth of the wood here. This is so he can plane off the irregularities and clean up the surface. Tom is now planing down to the depth that we marked. And you'll notice that caulk mark on there. The caulk is no longer on there because I scraped it off earlier. It's just dirt and grime. And so, because we would never run our planes over some kind of rough caulk. It might have even been construction adhesive, I don't know. But they were on the old stair steps to the basement, which we of course replaced. Tom is measuring and then scribing the placement of the legs and the apron, which are going to be cut from this board. And of course, he's placing them on the board so as to avoid as many knots and other flaws as possible. Next, Tom uses the frame saw that we made a few videos ago, or a previous video, to rip the board down into the two legs and the apron. Here, Tom is resawing a portion of the 2x12 stair tread into side rails. This is the top of the bench, and Tom is marking and then enhancing his mark for the cut to cut the top to length. And he just uses a crosscut saw to do this. And so he's using his own saw bench to do this, and in this case he has a dog now instead of his knee. The dogs are optional, and I'll put some in mind once I figure out where I want them to be. Don't forget to square off the ends, and this particular end is going to be attached to the side piece with a series of dovetail joints. So you'll want to have both of those matching ends very square. Pretty good. Tom is just checking the top with a panel gauge to make sure it truly is even. And now he's picking up the side panel leg so that he can plane the end or the edge of this board, the long edge that is down to the exact same width as the top of the bench. So this is basically a leg or a side panel. The other end has legs on it. Don't forget to mark both the top, the bottom, and the edges when you do this. And that way you can be sure to not overshoot your mark. Next, Tom just planes down to the marked line using a few different of his planes. He's using his small coffin plane here, and then he'll probably switch to his jack plane in a moment. And you'll notice that when he picks up his jack plane for the final smoothing, or the final depth, he often runs his leading hand finger along the edge, and that helps keep the sole of the plane level. When I do this, I actually have to wear gloves because it just wears my skin off too much to do this, but it doesn't seem to bother his hands. And don't forget to keep your plane moving smoothly, so he oils it with WD-40. And then when you get close, you want to keep checking for square to make sure your edge is square with your top surface. Next, Tom is getting the exact thickness of the side leg or side panel piece, and is scribing that thickness onto the top surface of the top of the bench. He needs to do this because that way he knows how deep to cut the dovetails that are going to connect these two pieces together. And he marks that on all four sides of the board. Top, bottom, and the two edges. Next, Tom determines the exact width of the top, and then he finds the middle using his sliding square, and he marks it from one side, and then he marks another mark on the other side. They should line up pretty well, and if they don't, the exact center between those two marks would be the center. And it looks like they did mark evenly, so now he's marking the two end dovetails. They're kind of like half dovetails. And now he's taking a larger chisel to mark and center that squarely after he squares off that center line with a square. And he basically eyeballs this. When I've done this before, I've actually put a little mark on the chisel blade so that I actually get it exact, but he's pretty good with eyeballing it. And now he's getting the center between the two centers and marking where he wants the center of the dovetails that go to either side of the center dovetail. There are many ways to do this and many ways to cut these dovetails in terms of size. And so he's going to make the center dovetail the largest dovetail and then have two corresponding ones on each side of that, which are smaller, and then he'll have the half dovetails at the very edges. And he uses the chisel just to mark the full base of the dovetail. And now he's just going to mark the angle that he wants the dovetails to be. And again, that's kind of a personal choice, what angle you want to use. And this little angle finder is a handy tool because then you're not using a protractor or some other more cumbersome method. And you can tighten it up. And he marks all the ones in one direction first, and then he'll go back and flip his little gauge over and mark the other sides. This is a close-up so that you can see him marking the dovetails across the end using a square. And you can see his well-marked dovetails there, where he used the chisel on the top surface, and how he cuts in from the waist side to enhance his marks. And for the camera, he's just going to color those marks in so that you can see them clearly. Even when I'm doing this, of course I'm much slower, I always pencil mark it, and then I color in the waist so I don't get confused. And now he's cutting in or enhancing those lines from the waist. So this is the top, and it's going to have 3 dovetails. I think I said the end dovetails were half dovetails. Well, really they're half dovetails of waist. That the half dovetails from the other piece will match up, of course, to those edges. With the waist clearly marked, you can see Tom is now using a saw to cut out the dovetails. And he's going to cut probably all in one direction first, and then he may flip the board around to cut the other direction since he's cutting right-handed. I know that's what I would do. He might not do it that way. We'll see. Nope, he didn't flip the board around. He's just going to change his angle of sawing to follow the lines. Just be careful so you don't cut past your depth line. Now that all the cuts have been made, Tom is now cutting the waste off of the two ends. And so he'll just flip the board over now to cut the other bit of waste off of that end. All the others are in between, so they are going to have to get chiseled out, because there's no way, of course, to cut them. It is best not to try to chisel out the entire waste from one side. So here Tom has chiseled out most of the waste from one side of this particular waste section, and now he flipped it over so that he can chop it the rest of the way. And I believe he's done it for all of them, although you can't see that. Okay, after all the waste was cut from that top side, he's using it now as a pattern to cut on the side or end piece. And so he's marking the edges of the top dovetails so that that becomes the waste cut from the bottom. Tom is now just enhancing the marks that he made by using the top as a pattern for the side dovetails. And once again, he's enhancing the line by cutting in from the waist side. You always want to cut in from the waist side so that you don't actually cut the part that you need to preserve. Next, saw the corresponding dovetails. If you would like to see a very detailed video about how we do dovetails, you can check out our link to our dovetail video, and I will put that in the notes and also right here on the screen. Make any adjustments that you need to make this fit perfectly, and then test fit it for a final fit, as Tom is doing here. Here, Tom is just checking the width so that he can correctly cut the dovetail tenons for the legs. The width of the board equals the depth of the tenon of the legs, and that's what he's marking here with the marking gauge. Next, he's marking the actual width or length of the tenon. It's not going to go through the entire width of the stock. He's going to cut a small shoulder in this. So I took a picture of this after he cut it and decided to label it to make this a little bit easier to understand. Note that the shoulder is going to add extra glue surface to the leg when it attaches to the top of the bench, and it's also going to provide a way to prevent the leg from racking against the top of the bench too. So it makes it a very strong and sturdy joint. So carefully mark your dovetail before you cut it, and then proceed to cut it as Tom is doing here. Here you can clearly see the shoulder as he completes that part of the cut of the dovetail. And in this last little segment of the dovetail, Tom completes the dovetail on one of the legs, and there are 2 legs. So this process gets repeated for the other leg. Here, Tom is measuring the top of the saw bench for the placement for the 2 different legs. So he's going to mark where he wants to cut the dovetail on each of the side edges and side of the top. The dovetail length, or width, however you like to think of that, is about 1 inch. So he's marking that from each edge of the board. And now he's going to actually use the dovetail itself to trace around it, because a lot of this is very referential when you do it. And that way your dovetails will match up quite nicely without having to have some kind of special dovetail shape that you always use. Just make them referential. After sawing the 2 diagonals, which I didn't show because it was so out of focus that I was embarrassed to put that in the video, it's time to chisel it out. And of course, you're going to chisel it out, and then you're going to test fit it and make any adjustments necessary to make a nice tight joint. And now he's just test fitting the joint, giving it a good firm tap, and it looks like it fits very well. There, you can see the joint from the top. And remember, on the bottom there's a shoulder extending beyond the wider portion of the dovetail. At this point, both legs have been attached, but not glued yet. And he is showing how to attach the 2 side rails or side aprons. This side apron is attached to both the end panel and the leg with a half lap, half dovetail joint. Tom uses this because the straight lap joint provides rack resistance and the dovetail part provides more locking. Now, simply cut the half dovetail, cutting on the diagonal first and then cutting into the base of the diagonal from the side edge of the board. Now that both half dovetails are cut, mark the position on the end panel and one of the legs where you want the dovetail lap to begin. Clamp the side rail or apron to the end panel and also to one of the legs, and then mark with a knife the outline of the dovetail joint in those members, because that's where you're going to cut the lap, or the half lap, I should say. Use a marking gauge to find the exact depth or thickness of the side rail or apron and secure that, and then mark that depth onto both the leg where you're going to cut the half lap and also the end panel. Carefully mark your scribe marks with a knife, and Tom is marking both the top and the bottom. Remember, the top is down and the bottom is currently up in this picture, and you can see the small outline of the dovetail over there. And it's simply going to be a half lap with one side cut in the dovetail conformation. Tom is going to cut the half lap in one of the legs first. And you'll note that none of this has been glued together. And of course, you don't want to glue anything together until everything is fit. And then at the end, you can glue it all together. And so he's going to cut this down, and he's going to use the router plane to smooth out the bottom of the cut after he chisels away most of the waste. Tom already set the router plane to the correct depth so that once he is done chiseling, he can just pick it up and smooth off the bottom of that cut. Once it's cut, test fit the joint and make any adjustments necessary.
Yep.
After a few adjustments with the chisel, the joint fits perfectly. Now rinse and repeat on the end panel, and then do the other side rail on the other leg and other side of the end panel. The last piece to be cut and fit is the small brace between the two legs. This little end brace is attached to each of the legs with another half lap, half dovetail joint. So the process is exactly the same as you just did for the two side aprons or side rails. Both of the half lap, half dovetails are cut on the end brace, and Thomas clamped that to the two legs and is marking the position of the half lap dovetail corresponding cut into the legs. Now it's time for the final fitting, and then if all is well, and it should be, it'll be time to take it apart and glue it up. And we have success. Everything fits just wonderfully. And now it's time to take it apart and then glue it all back together. Now that it's all glued, Tom is just putting clamps on until the glue is set, and then I can finish this little project. The glue has set. We let it sit overnight, and now we're taking the clamps off. Tom decided to smooth off the top surface of this bench a little bit and smooth out any irregularities from the dovetail joints. Remember, this was really crummy wood we started off with, just kind of old white fir construction grade stair treads. But this is utilitarian, so it didn't need to be a fine piece of furniture. Tom is using a small gouge to smooth out a couple of little tear-outs. And after all, this was very tear-prone white fir. Not a very good wood, but it's just fine for this utilitarian saw bench. Tom gives it a final smoothing out with the plane. And then there are some imperfections in the surface of this wood. So he's going to drill those out and put some plugs in. We constantly make plugs for projects for filling up screw holes, etc., so we always have a stash of them. It's usually my job to fill up all the plug holes, and I don't mind doing it. So apply glue in those drilled out holes, and then put a plug in each one, pound the little plug in, and then chisel it off flat. I actually usually wait till the glue's really set before I do it, but I think Tom's just going to go ahead and do it right away. I decided I wanted my bench to be a little bit darker than Tom's bench, so I grabbed some utilitarian stain and started staining it. And after the stain was thoroughly dry, of course I had to test out my new saw bench to make sure I could saw easily on it. And I can. It's just the right height for me, and I like to put a little pad under my bony knees when I saw. And you might like to do the same too. But it's short enough for me that I can get good leverage when using the saw. Please see the video notes for the link to the PDF directions to make this saw bench.